All right, welcome everybody to the third Giants eighth grade rollout of the 2023-24 school year. Um, I am Dave Johnson, one of the hosts tonight. And as I just finished telling our one participant who is here so far, I chose some really dumb dates for our third rollout. So we are looking at a slightly smaller crew tonight, but that's okay. Phil and I are going to troop her on, and we'll have all of this stuff rolled out and ready for you to go. And we'll have the recap videos, which I'm sure many of you will be watching. So welcome those of you who are here live, all one of you so far. Hi, Susan. And welcome those of you who are watching the recap later. Um, Tonight, we are going to skip the How Did It Go Unit 2 edition, mostly because, again, we're looking at honoring everybody's time tonight. And that means I'm going to launch straight into the Unit 3 overview and the Unit 3 overview presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share desktop number 1 here real quick. And I'm going to pull over the overview. So yeah, from a bird's eye overview standpoint, Unit 3 of 8th grade Giants is all about growth. And you can see from the content expectations that we have listed on the overview document, we are hitting the 4.2 standards. And we're going to look at how the Northeast and the South started taking some vastly different paths. This story actually begins in fifth grade, and last night we talked with a small group of fifth grade teachers about how important it was that they really hit home regional differences in fifth grade because of how integral that is to the story that we tell in eighth grade. But a piece we didn't tell them that we'll note to you is that these regional differences are still very much in play, even in 2023. And while we're not beating students over the head with that, you have plenty of opportunity in this unit to talk to students about how some of those regional differences have shaped and even continue to shape America today. So it's also here that we're going to start to get into the institution of slavery. And while we'll hit home on this harder in future units, especially when we talk about the reform era next time, and slavery and what to do about it, that is the can that we continue to kick down the road through the whole eighth grade course. It was a problem that was not fully resolved at the Constitutional Convention. And as you'll see in this unit and in forthcoming units as well, every time we've got the opportunity to definitively address it, we just decide, we're going to take this solution instead. And so we just keep kicking that can down the road. We'll also get a little bit into the age of Jackson. And while we don't highlight a lot in this era in tonight's rollout for the sake of time, we have some great conversations about that first great norm shattering president and how some of his actions impacted the growth of our nation during this historical era. Phil and I, when we were meeting on Monday to kind of finalize things, we noted that a lot of eighth grade teachers have a really big Age of Jackson unit. And that is totally good and fine because you can frame that expansion piece through the Jackson story. But we actually don't have a ton of content expectations on Jackson, and he's not really called out in more than just one content expectation. And even that, it's that, 4.2.3, where we're talking about the annexation of the West through the Louisiana Purchase, removal of indigenous people. So we take a slightly different approach to Jackson, but I also know eighth grade teachers are really good at teaching Jackson already. And finally, we're going to begin to tie it all together. There's no bow on this package anywhere in eighth grade because we're still dealing with things from this era even today. But we will talk about some of the consequences of expansion and set up a solid foundation that will take us through pretty much the rest of this course. So if you recall, you'll remember I told you in the developmental history of eighth grade giants that different authors wrote units 0, 1, and 2. And while Phil and I consulted with them on the development of those units, they departed after the second rollout back in 2017. So Unit 3 is where Phil and I took over. And that's where we're going to bring a shift to the look and feel of the units overall. There wasn't a huge need to retroactively refit the original units with changes that we made Unit 3 on, because content wise, this was a great and logical place to start to change up some of those activities. And because these units are Dave and Phil originals, you're going to start to see some patterns emerge in some of the different types of activities that we're going to do for the rest of the year. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the unit overview presentations we've created for you to introduce to your students. So I'm not going to run this presentation for you, but one of the things you'll note is that starting with this unit, we kick off with a Unit 3 overview presentation. And this overview presentation is designed for you to deliver it to your students, usually over the course of about 20-30 minutes. We try to give you an idea of the amount of time in that center column. And there are no presentation notes, so I'm going to take this part out of the lesson right now because it's really just highlighting the questions and the different topics from the student level that we'll be discussing throughout this whole unit. Now, we've also developed what we're calling the student journal for each of these units as well. And if you go into the student journal, this is something that students will ultimately make their own copy of, and you'll have them keep coming back to this over the course of the whole unit. And so in the overview presentation, at one point, we have a stop and think, like, how would nearly doubling the size of the United States affect the country? Record your thoughts and ideas in this box here. And that's for them on day one, while they're going through, like, what would some of the things that they can think of be? List them here. And then this becomes an artifact that they will fill out through the course of the whole unit. So when you get to the end of the unit, they will ideally have this whole thing filled out. And if you wanted students to answer the compelling question as part or all of your assessment, they've got, 6 pages of notes here that should be leading them in that direction already. So that's another big change that we introduce in Unit 3 that we got a lot of really good feedback on from teachers. We still don't have it in Units 1 and 2, primarily because I don't think we need them quite as much. They're review-based units, but if you guys feel differently, we will, obviously think about going back and adding them there. But you will see this in Unit 3, in Unit 4, in Unit 5, and in Unit 6, and in Unit 7. So you will see these for the remainder of the Giants units. We have an overview presentation, and we also have a student journal for them to fill out. And then the final new addition that you're going to start to see is we have um, I did a lot of work with my own local 7 school districts as part of Wexford Misaki ISD way back in 2015 and 16 about, hey, can we get rid of the I can statements on the board and can we instead maybe do compelling and supporting questions instead? And that was okay in Wexford, although all of those principals have now moved on to other roles elsewhere. So I should probably have the conversation again. But we provide for you posters that you can print off. They're designed to print off on not tabloid size paper, but the legal size paper. So the 8.5 by 14. And you can just have these up through the course of the unit. You will always have the compelling question poster up because we're tackling that question through the course of the whole unit. But then as you move between the lessons, you can put up the one with each individual supporting question. And you can see we've built down at the bottom, we've got the content expectation coding here because that's a thing that sometimes principals are looking for when they come into a classroom. They're like, hey, I want to see that you're hitting your standards, and I need you to prove to me that you're doing that. Between the Giants lessons and between the compelling and supporting questions posters, we've got you covered. So think about printing these off and cycling through them in lieu of or in addition to your I can statements, because we really, really, really want kids to be approaching social studies through an inquiry lens. So, with that out of the way, like I said, I'm not going to go through this whole presentation with you, but again, you'll see in Unit 2, you learned briefly about the Louisiana Purchase. The United States nearly doubled in size. How might nearly doubling the size of the United States affect the country? Answer the question by writing, brainstorming a list of ideas, or generating new questions, etc. This is where they're prompted to go into their student journals and do this, so it's all recorded in one place. And then we bring in some review from fifth grade. We talk about the New England colonies and what developed here and what developed in the middle colonies and the southern colonies. We also had a great conversation with the fifth grade teachers last night about why naming the colonies what we have named them is a little bit problematic. And Phil might weigh in on that in a little bit when we get into his North America regions and corn versus cotton, et cetera. But the point that we made with the fifth grade teachers is that while the naming scheme is a bit problematic, it will show up on the M step. So we need to teach kids both. And then going through again, we're asking kids to think back to that constitutional convention. They'll record their thoughts and ideas in their student journal, which again is a great way to capture their ideas and thoughts. Um, Keep in mind, this can kick thing is going to pop up every unit because it's the metaphor we use because it's a good one. We get into review on distribution of political power, rights of individuals, et cetera. And all of this is laying the groundwork for slavery, the whole states' rights versus slavery debate in terms of the causes of the Civil War. All of this is starting here, and we're really starting to point kids towards, thinking about this in this unit. We introduce the supporting questions. We ask them to give their initial thoughts and reasoning on it. We go back into some maps of the United States. We talk about the Louisiana Purchase again, because that is all part of the westward expansion. We're going to get into the Missouri Compromise, and you can see we've got Missouri labeled clearly on this map with Phil's regioning scheme here, which is one of my favorite activities of his. And then we finish up by taking a look at some stuff that is going to lead into more stuff in both this unit and the next one when we get into the reform era. And we also introduced that we'll be getting into Andrew Jackson and the Age of Jackson. So the final thing that we're going to try to ask students to do in each of these overview presentations is to start thinking about what the compelling question is, how does growth change a nation, and start recording their thoughts. So if you have an administrator that wants you to demonstrate growth, and these student journals are a great way to track it. Here's what they thought about this question on day one, and then staple a copy of their essay question or essay prompt, ask the same question on the final exam. And poof, you've got growth in a much better way than giving your students the final exam on the first day of class and asking them to take it, knowing full well that they're going to fail it. This gets you something a little more actionable about the major issues that we're going to be grappling with. So that is the Unit 3 overview presentation, the Unit 3 student journal, all of that in a nutshell. Any questions from anybody here before I stop my share and turn things over to Phil? Hearing none, Phil, we're already a little ahead of schedule this evening, so there you go. And I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn things over to Phil for his burst on North American regions, corn versus cotton, and the Erie Canal. Take it away, Phil.
Okay.
I can
Like Dave said,
hear you and see your screen, so you're good.
like Dave said, Giants introduces the idea of regions as early as third grade. They make regions of nut trees in the Anishinaabe settlements and copper mines and things like that in Michigan. But if people haven't done giants before in your curriculum, you probably want to go over this region lesson that we put out there. And you want to do this because of what Dave mentioned. And that is a lot of textbooks talk about the regions, like the Middle Atlantic region. And I just encourage you to go out on the web and put those words in as keywords and find out how many different states are called the Middle Atlantic region, because it's an awkward problem. What region is a way that people organize their knowledge of space. It's a group of places that are like each other and close to each other. It's as simple as that and as profound as that. because if you draw a line around those places, you can make a regional map. The question is, why do we make regional maps? And the answer is real simple. It's much easier to remember them than to remember all the individual places. And like I say, in fifth grade, we have them go through the regions of North America. It is the biggest continent north-south. It's got the widest variety of natural environments inside of it because it goes all the way from the equator to the Arctic Ocean. But just 4 lines can help us organize that very easily. And I'm going through this fast because the PowerPoint's out there for you to look at. The rock line starts at the northern tip of Alaska. It goes to the east coast of Mexico, and it separates the western region, which are young rocks, steep slopes, high land, and a lot of metal ores, from the eastern lowland region, which is older rocks, low hills. Even the mountains out east tend to be way much lower than out west. And a lot of oil and gas, but not very many metal mines. That's a useful distinction to have, and it actually shows up politically right now in some of our rules about the use of public lands. The second line has been described as a sagging hammock with its bottom in the middle of Michigan, and most people can remember that pretty easily. That's the farm line. It separates a northern region that it's too cold, the summer is too short for farming, from the southern region where you can grow different crops. The West, however, is a whole lot more complicated. Basically, the low areas of the West are hot and the high areas are cold, all the way from Mexico to the middle of Canada. The tree line runs due north from the south tip of Texas. It separates the rainy eastern forests from the drier grasslands on the Great Plains. And here again, the West is more complicated. The valleys tend to be dry. The mountaintops tend to get enough rain for trees or even snow. If you put those last 2 lines together, they do a real nice job of isolating the part of the country where people can actually live on the land. And so you see that with the night lights. They're scattered all over in that eastern part. When you get north or west of that, the night lights tend to be clustered in urban areas with lots of empty space in between where nobody can actually make a living. And then finally, the line that is the most important for us in 8th grade, the cotton line, runs right about east-west through the middle of the farm region. We draw it as a straight line. It actually wiggles around the mountains a little bit. As you know, this line is awfully important in U.S. history because south of that line, the growing season is long enough for cotton. And we'll talk a little bit more later about that. So that's it. 4 quick lines to divide North America into a Western mountain region, a Northern cold region, a Great Plains grass region, a Great Lakes farm region, and a Southern cotton and pine region, and then one we don't worry about in 8th grade, Central American hot and hilly region. If you can picture them in your mind, that's fine. If not, the PowerPoint actually has a whole set of pictures, and you could move these pictures to the front or scatter them around as you wish. They basically describe what these different regions are like with a lot more detail than I've tried to do right now. But I'm also going through this too fast, so you can't read it right now. I would want to slow down just a minute here to draw these lines on the satellite image. The mountain line does a pretty good job of separating the complicated, rugged areas of the West from the flatter areas that are smoother out east. The farm line separates out the northern forest, mostly what we would call Christmas trees, spruce, fir, pine, no farms. The tree line isolates the grassland region of the middle of the continent. Even though the Louisiana Purchase added that to the United States, Very few people moved out there for an awfully long time because they just didn't know how to cope with that environment. They had to wait until people invented things like barbed wire and deep well pumps and different varieties of wheat from Turkey and places like that. In other words, the tree line pretty much stopped westward expansion for about 50 years. And then the cotton line that runs across the middle here and wiggles around the mountains a little bit. Like I say, this way of dividing the continent actually works pedagogically. This is what a sixth grade student drew from memory 2 weeks after the presentation with no warning at all on a pop quiz. And another one that did pretty much the same thing. You know, they get it, and that helps them organize their additional knowledge. Now, one reason to go through this is to realize that all regional maps are generalizations, and they're made for a particular purpose. An equally important goal is to realize that a few simple lines can organize a lot of information about North America. And I'll give you a couple examples for adults, and then a couple examples that we're going to actually use in 8th grade. So just as a review, here's the daytime and nighttime satellite images, and you can draw these lines on here. The last one is not obvious on either of the satellite images or not, because the length of the growing season basically separated different species of trees and different kinds of crops. It didn't really separate different ways of using the land. Now, this can organize a lot of information, like I said. Got a couple examples here. These German immigrants in 1898. Or how about people that have health insurance in the year 2000? Diversity of frogs and toads. Life expectancy in the year 2022. And then the one that we really need to take a look at for 8th grade. So mentally draw the lines on that map. And you can ignore some of those ultrasols up in Pennsylvania. That's a complication that we don't need to get into right now, but it has to do with a particular kind of bedrock. They are really pretty awful soils because ultrasols generally form where there's more than enough rain for trees and at least 7 months with no frost. In other words, that's the environment that creates ultrasols. It also creates things like yellow fever and hookworm and other stuff that we'll talk about when we get closer to the Civil War. In the meantime, right from the get-go, right from 1776, and in fact 100 years earlier, we've got to remember that ultrasols are inherently not very fertile for a couple of reasons. That the heat has taken away most of the organic matter, and the rain has taken away most of the nutrients. So right now, 2023, the corn yield in the average in South Carolina was 130 bushels per acre. That's one of the highest yields they've ever had. Alabama was at 120 bushels per acre. And on my farm in Wisconsin, I'd call 120 to 130 bushels a crop failure. Michigan is a little bit lower average yield than Wisconsin because it's a little bit rainier and the rain tends to wash nutrients out of the soil even after you've added fertilizer. Illinois comes in at over 200 bushels per acre, and in fact, the 220 that they got this year is about 30 less than they got last year. Even South Dakota gets 160 bushels per acre. Now, those are pretty good numbers. It's a little bit harder for us to come up with the numbers before the Civil War, but this is the best average I've been able to come up with. That in the Midwest, the general average was around 23 bushels of corn per acre, and you'd work about 60 hours in order to get that. In the Southeast, you got less than half as much and worked harder. And, and I don't know how to emphasize this enough, the kind of corn that would grow on an ultrasol is going to be lower in protein and lower in magnesium and calcium and iron and a couple other important nutrients. In other words, what you're looking at as simple numbers, just park in the back of your head. Midwestern farmer would get twice the yield for less work, is also a recipe for malnutrition. That one of the problems that plagued the South all the way in early history was the fact that they had not yet invented freezers and long distance trucks and high yield crops and so on. Malnutrition was a major issue throughout the rural South. And that's going to come back when we're looking at the Civil War, in a pretty big way. And this is where environmental regions had a huge impact on history, and where that line of 210 days of frost-free season, because cotton needs 200 frost-free days. In other words, you had to grow cotton south of the line on the kind of climate that made ultrasols. And I put a list up here just to remind us: frost-free season, ultrasalt, low yields, malnutrition, cotton, slavery, Dixie. All of these maps are similar because there's a causal connection that runs all the way through that sequence. Now, we've got a couple activities that do that in a completely backhanded way, because I left one quick thing out of my list right there. So the handouts include an activity about the amount of labor that it takes to grow corn or cotton. And I'm going to walk through it just kind of step by step for a second. The soil is different. We've already said that. One of the advantages of winter in the north is that it slows down the worms and insects and microorganisms that decompose leaves and roots. And so you wind up having some of this black organic matter in the soil. These are the partly decomposed leaves and roots. And they give that soil a kind of a crumbly texture. The southern red soil doesn't have that, and it tends to be a lot harder. So right off the bat, it probably takes twice as much time and energy to plow an acre of land in Georgia than it does in Illinois. Then we add snow to that fact. And I don't need pictures for that, because you guys are in Michigan, you know what snow looks like. The snow has a great advantage because it comes along with frost, and frost and snow add moisture and they break up the soil, which makes it a whole lot easier to plow. So what I said was, just based on the inherent soil characteristics, the northern soil was about half as hard to plow. Now it becomes like a quarter as hard to plow because it's been softened up by the snow and frost. Then things get really messy because you're going to have to plant your crop. And in the north, you plant about 10,000 corn seeds, and they're nice and hard and smooth. And in the south, you've got to plant twice as many seeds, 20,000, and they're hairy and they stick together, and it's pain to separate them out in order to plant them. It's actually still a pain now, even with the mechanical planter. It takes more than 3 times as long to plant a field of cotton as a field of corn, even with machinery. And then the plants start to grow, and the corn plant grows up pretty tall. So you only have to weed the field for about 4 or 5 weeks, and then the plants are high enough that they shade the ground. Cotton never gets high enough to shade the ground, and so you've got to weed that field for about 4.5 months, maybe 5 months. So that's about 3 times as long. Now, I've been using numbers like twice as long, 3 times as long, and so on. You could make a math lesson out of this. If your kids are having trouble with basic math right now, then don't make this just a social studies lesson. Make it a math lesson too. Have them start adding up these fractions. That if it takes twice as long to plow and twice as long because it's been broken by the not broken by the frost, and twice as long because you've got twice as many seeds, and so on like this. Because we could do that in a really big way when we get to the harvest. A corn plant, and remember, there's only 10,000 of them on that field. It's got 1 or 2 ears. Takes you what, 3 seconds to pick them and throw it into the wagon? Cotton has between 15 and 30 little cotton balls that have to be picked out of every plant. And remember, you got twice as many of those plants. So now we're not talking twice as much work. We're talking 15 or 20 or 30 times as much work. And then we've got this thing, and we've got to try to make something out of it. And with corn, in order to get it ready to throw in the cooking pot, you kind of pull off the husks. And you might even take an ear of corn into the classroom and demonstrate for them that it takes, 5 seconds to husk a ear of corn. You can go out on Amazon.com and buy yourself, because what I've got at the bottom is a picture that I took of some cotton that we bought for the 5th grade class. Inside of that cotton bowl are about 30 seeds that you have to pull out one at a time by hand. This is what made the cotton gin so awfully important as an invention. But if you add all this up, remember, you can't grow corn in the South that is nutritious and as high yielding as it is in North. You've got to come up with something that you can sell. But the crop that you can grow and sell takes somewhere between 50 and 200 times as much hours of labor per acre as an acre of corn does. That's a huge regional problem. It also underscores in a big way why the South wind up justifying slavery. Because one of the interesting things about the slave trade is that we actually imported more slaves into New York than we did into Mississippi and Louisiana. But the people in New York kind of didn't need them. And it's a whole lot easier to be an abolitionist if your economy does not depend upon having that size of a labor force. But then this comes back in Dave's metaphor about kicking the can. This comes back to bite the South in a big way, because once the South bought into the idea of slavery, it started to justify it, started to believe the people who were justifying it, whether they were the religious leaders or the political leaders. The common people started to believe the people that were saying slavery was all right. Suddenly the South stops being a good magnet for immigrants from Europe and so on. So now there are some exceptions to that rule. When I'm putting some stars out here, like in the Wiregrass region of Alabama or in the Winston-Salem area of North Carolina or up in the mountains here, these are areas where the conditions just simply didn't even allow cotton to grow at all. And interestingly enough, every place that I put a star up there actually organized an army to fight on the side of the Union. The people up here in Jasper and Coleman County, Alabama, had sent soldiers to fight on the side of the Union. So the South was a complicated place. The slavery did not work everywhere there. You still had to have a little bit better geology and so on. Like I say, that's one of the stories that I'm supposed to say. And then there was the thing that kind of put the nail in the coffin for the South. And that was the fact that you could go inland from someplace, but that is a big, long story called the Erie Canal. And as Dave said in the in this middle column. The Erie Canal story that we have is actually something that I and my wife and about 15 teachers put together when we were in New York for 5 years. So we just decided to port all of that over here to our website too, and let you pick and choose what you want. And what I'm going to do right now is do exactly what you should do with the long PowerPoints. I'm going to pick and choose and tell the story like a drink out of a fire hose. We've got actually 5 separate PowerPoints. One of them is about a puzzle, and the puzzle is simple. If you look at Pennsylvania, it's got a whole lot of mountain ranges, and they're running the wrong direction if you want to go from the east to the west. And yet, in the middle of those mountains, you see a sign to a town called Newport. And why does the town have a name like Port in the middle here? Theory number one is that Freddie Newport built a town and named it after it, you know. And then you go 5 more miles down the road and there's Port Royal. And then you go 20 more miles and there's Coalport. And you go a little further and there's Port Byron and then Weedsport and a whole lot of others. Now it's become a kind of a geographical puzzle. That could be used to set up the second PowerPoint. How do we choose a route for the Erie Canal? After the Revolution, people wanted to get to Middle America. They wanted to get to those good fertile soils that they knew were over on the other side because they had, reports from fur traders and things like that about how much better the corn was when you were in there. So they're trying to find out how to get there. And this PowerPoint just goes step by step to explain you're not going to go up the Potomac River because it's got a whole bunch of waterfalls and rapids. The only city that actually had a good river to go toward the west was New York City. The Hudson River, you can take a big boat all the way up to Albany, and then there's a student worksheet that they could use either as an independent study, as a group study, or as a follow along the PowerPoint. When you get to Albany, you want to decide, you go north to cold Canada, or do you go west toward the frontier? If you go west, you go up the Mohawk River and you get to Syracuse. Now, do you go north real quick to Lake Ontario, or do you go the hard way to Lake Erie? And the answer is, if you go to Lake Ontario, you're stuck because Niagara Falls isn't going to let you go any further. But from Lake Erie, you can go all the way to Detroit, to Cleveland, to Chicago on a boat. In other words, works real well. There are authors that want to make this a dramatic political story, stuff about Clinton's ditch and Fulton's folly and all that other kind of stuff. The fact is, this was a no-brainer job. The Grand Canal of China is 3 times as long. They built it 2,000 years ago. Now, I couldn't say this in New York because in New York, the Erie Canal is the next thing to a religious artifact. It is the world's greatest engineering achievement to New York teachers. Seriously, when you look at a map, choosing a route for the Erie Canal was a no-brainer. You go up to Albany, you go west to Buffalo, you got a couple locks on the way. The PowerPoint explains how they work. It just wasn't that hard. Now, what were the effects, and what did the other states do? The effects are pretty simple. They cut the cost of hauling a ton of grain by about 90%. Farmers began to grow all kinds of food for sale to New York City and for export to Europe. People could make even more money by milling wheat into flour before loading it onto the canal boats. Upstate New York became a big grain producing area. And again, this is a worksheet that you can give to the students as an independent project or a group project or a watch PowerPoint. But the fact is, the Erie Canal made people really rich. Every canal town has a whole bunch of great big mansions. These things are roughly 10 times as big as the average plantation house in the South. The average Southern plantation house had 4 rooms. Count them in this building. And the biggest winner by far was New York City, because the Erie Canal brought grain, which they called feedstock, and animals, which they called livestock, to New York for export to Europe. That helped support the biggest job in the entire city of New York, the New York Stock Exchange. Now, while it was hauling all those goods from the inland, it was bringing the immigrants. And it basically meant that the western frontier was going to be connected to New York. It was not going to be connected to Virginia or Boston or South Carolina. If you go to a place like Michigan, you're going to find all kinds of town names that were named after the Erie Canal, you know, from Clinton and Rochester near Detroit to Waterloo and so on in the western part of the state. And then the third thing, and again, this is a handout that you can use, is the Erie Canal allowed people the luxury of inventing new ideas. From the Mormon Church to women's rights, there were all kinds of social movements that developed along the Erie Canal. It was just a kind of an intellectual ferment built upon a really solid farm and industrial base. So it reduced the cost, a huge benefit, made a lot of New Yorkers rich. What did the other states do about it? And there's a story that is the third one. Pennsylvania repeated what I will call the bumper sticker of the geographically ignorant. And that is, it works where they are, so it ought to work where we are. New York has a new canal and they're getting rich, so we should build a canal. And you've heard that a lot of times here, you know. Unfortunately, where New York has a nice river valley going between the mountains, Pennsylvania just has a whole bunch of mountain ridges. They're the result of a collision with Africa a long time ago. The rocks are tilted up on edge, which means that they make rapids in the stream, which means you need some more locks, which means your whole canal is getting to be ridiculous, and then you hit the Allegheny Mountain. And the Allegheny Mountain is a high ridge with no river gap through it. And when they saw that, they repeated what I will call the bumper sticker of the economically ignorant. We've already spent so much on this canal project, we better finish it. And their solution was to lift the canal boats, put them on wheels, and use ropes to drag them up the mountain. The problem is the mountain was so high that you needed 10 of these inclined planes in order to get up there. I mean, it was impressive engineering, and it was economically hopeless. The whole thing went bankrupt within 7 years. Couldn't even pay the basic operating cost, and it was abandoned. Now, the conclusion to that part, the Erie Canal reduced the cost of moving goods. Pennsylvania was one place that tried to build a canal. So did Washington, D.C., so did Savannah, so did Charleston, and every one of them failed. The Erie Canal today helped all kinds of people get rich. New York, Albany, Buffalo, Toronto, Detroit, Chicago, they're all big winners. Philadelphia, Boston, Montreal lost. Charleston lost in a big way. It was arguably the most important economic force in the mid-1800s. That's the story you want to tell, not my gal Sal with a mule and I have to duck for the low bridge or whatever kind of thing we, do with Erie Canal stories. And yet today, the Erie Canal is not used at all. I mean, it's a canoe race. It's a place to put a couple of commercial traffic peaked at 3,000 trips before the Civil War. In 2008, there were only 50. Railroads are faster. They could reach farther. Giant ore boats could carry stuff around the Great Lakes a whole lot cheaper. And all the factories along the Erie Canal basically had to close up or turn into condominiums. the canal is still heavily used by pleasure boats. That raises a really messy question. Is this a good use of tax dollars to keep the canal open for yachts for the rich? You know, it's a complicated question because there's a lot of businesses that depend on the canal. If we go back to Newport, we can see the big houses. We can see the Canal Tavern, it's still running. The Towpath Dining Room is still running. There's a lot of features named for these old canals. Even though the Erie Canal doesn't carry much commercial traffic, people depend on it in a lot of different ways now. And I didn't only run about 5 minutes over even when he gave me 5 minutes to go. Knew this was happening, didn't we?
Hey, it's okay. You are actually right on the time for the actual schedule, and mine, does not always have to take the amount of time I allotted, so we're good. Just making sure I'm sharing the right screen here. There we go. So if we dig even deeper into the Erie Canal, I wanted to take a quick opportunity to share one of our revisions to these units this time around that's a little unique. While we'll be discussing transportation in more detail in later sections, as Phil's already alluded, the Erie Canal made a lot of future pieces of America's growth and division easier to understand. And we've always had this next activity here as part of eighth grade Giants, but we've revised it strategically. You're still going to be putting students into multiple groups, but we've added a new reading that you might choose to give some of your lower readers. So was talking with our participants before the break about post pandemic what we're seeing, particularly with the kids that are in middle school right now. So while the current batch of third graders might be a normal group again, that did not go through public schools during part of the collective trauma of the last 4 years. Um, the next few years in particular, you may want to rely a little more heavily on this second reading that we've added. Um, you'll notice we're going to start seeing things in some of these lessons that say with AI enhancements. And that will keep in parentheticals in the lesson plan so that you know what you are about to see when you get into them. Um, but this right here is the original text, I should say. So this is what appeared if you looked at Giants prior to this year, if you've used these resources before. But what we've got now below it is a alternative for struggling readers, and this is one that we ran through the AI. I ran through the AI tools that are out there. And what I ended up doing with this was I was able to use the artificial intelligence to adapt it and modify it for a slightly less proficient reader. So I believe with this one, I asked the AI to rewrite it for me at the fifth grade level, and it did a halfway decent job. And I made some changes, and you still may make some changes as well. And then you'll also notice we've added discussion questions, and some of these are Dave created, and some of them are AI created. In particular, we ask the similar questions. I created the original ones, and then we ask them to make them a little more concise again for a fifth grader, even though you're teaching eighth graders. So note that this second reading is actually an accommodated version for struggling readers. You'll take this part off when you give it to students. And just note that we have these in there. So if you're still dividing your class up into 2 or 3, if you want a group just for your struggling readers groups, you'll then separate those groups into smaller chunks. So let's say if you've got a class of 28, you'll end up with 7 groups of 4. And let's say 3 of them are reading prompt A, 3 of them are going to read prompt B, and one of those groups is going to read the accommodated version. Everyone gets the maps that are at the very end of this. And you can still choose to have students prepare an oral presentation on the questions that they're given, or divvy up the question amongst the groups using each reading. It's entirely up to you, but the accommodated version of those questions are still asking the same thing. They're just doing it in a little more straightforward way, in a way that we hope some of your struggling readers will connect with a little bit more. Um, Students will spend about one class period working together to answer the questions for their section, developing their presentation, and you'll kick off the next class period with their oral presentations. So this activity, when paired with Phil's stuff, does a great job of getting to the heart of what's so important about the Erie Canal. And so what we're going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pause the recording because we're going to take our 5-minute break now. And when we come back in 5 minutes, we are going to motor through a lesson 2 overview, and we're gonna go through the back half of the agenda here. So it is 5:19, so let's be back here at 5:24, and we will continue on from there.
Chat says she's back, so
All right, we'll do it. All right, so coming back here, lesson 2, and Susan, that's totally fine. You've been a great sport, so we appreciate you. Coming back here, I'm going to switch my screen to number 1 here, and I'm going to pull open the lesson 2 piece. So lesson 2 is where we are going to end up with a little bit more on the issue of slavery. And again, this is structured this way because of the compelling question for the unit and the supporting questions that we chose. Anything that you feel like, gosh, I'd rather do this with this part of it, move it around. It's completely fine. But lesson 2, like I said, is where we end up with a little bit more on the issue of slavery. We're nowhere near done discussing it. It's a key issue for any study of United States history. But as we look at the growth of the nation, as we continue to expand and bring new states into the fold, we continue to kick the can down the road. And so with lesson 2, I'm not going to we don't give you a lesson by lesson overview presentation for every lesson, but to transition kids away from that collection of activities that we just finished rolling out and into these, we give you a overview presentation for lesson 2 that starts to focus in on our study of slavery. And this is where we get back to things that we talked about last night with regional economic differences and how the South developed one way and the Northeast developed another, and how we run into these problems. So the cotton gin is something else that's addressed in this particular unit. And Phil and I had some interesting conversations about differing amounts of cotton that people could pick through both with and without the gin. So we've tried to give you some opportunities to showcase that in here as well. And overall, you'll end this presentation by sort of discussing these 3 things with students before launching into your larger overview. Um, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and Phil's got a piece on the geohistogram and clickable maps before I bring us through with the final sets of things that are all going to be the Dave show. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Phil for the geohistogram and the clickable maps portion.
we see a geohistogram.
I see the geohistogram presentation. Yep.
And again, this is a presentation that is up on the website, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each frame here. There's a rationale that's kind of important. The more engaging we make our other educational experiences, the websites, the games, the songs, the videos, the plays, the activities that we do, the more crucial it is to help students put that information into context. And that's what the geohistogram is basically about. It's a big box. Space goes from west to east across the top, west on the left, that makes sense. Time goes from the distant past on the bottom to the present at the top, just like archaeological records, just like the papers on my desk. The old ones tend to be down at the bottom of the pile. The top bar is divided into 5 major regions, and there's a map to show where they are. And the basic graphic uses color to show roughly how important each of those regions was at different times in the past. Importance being defined as a combination of population, wealth, and political clout. Now, suppose you put Jamestown down there at about the year 1600, first British settlement in the southern region. Question is, how do student brains encode that? And the answer is they do it through different pathways. It's in the bottom right corner. It's near the tip of the purple blob. It's about the same time as New England. Those are with parallel brain networks. And there are individual differences in your class. And we're trying to take that into account. A left to right timeline actually discriminates against about 1/3 of the students in your class because their brain's timeline is actually organized vertically. I could give you cards of the research that backs this up, but you probably don't want to be reading that kind of thing. There's a way to show where the different indigenous people live. The Lakota were out here on the plains, and the Cherokee in the southern mountains, and the Haudenosaunee in New England. You can use symbols to talk about the Spanish missions, or Santa Fe, or Detroit, as the first major settlements in each of those regions. Then you can take the names off and turn this into a quiz. Like, how is the student going to remember Santa Fe is the second one in from the left? It's in the lower left corner, an absolute location. It's about the same time as Jamestown. And this is where the geohistogram gives you these little ahas all the time, that you might not have thought about the fact that those two places were founded within a few dozen years of each other. Now, you notice the blobs keep changing shapes here because the Northwest Ordinance allowed them to start expanding. Louisiana Purchase suddenly let people go out onto the plains. The gold rush encouraged a lot of people to move to the West Coast. The Civil War caused a dramatic reduction in the wealth and population of the South. The Dust Bowl did the same thing to the Great Plains. A lot of Okies went to California. Then the oil embargo came along, and suddenly the Great Plains are a better place to be because you got oil underneath them. At any time, students can add almost any kind of information to this framework. The cotton gin was invented, and look what happened to the wealth of the South all of a sudden. Frederick Douglass was contemporaneous with the Civil War and a sudden reduction in the importance of the South. Barbed wire allowed people to move out onto the plains. Henry Ford, you get the idea. There's a whole bunch of activities already written for the geohistogram. There's an activity about novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin. And people can put that on and then say what else was happening about the same time. Other topics that have already been written up, and we're still paying teachers to write up new activities, but explorers, migration, strikes, presidential homes, documents, things like that. So you could look at immigration through time with the geohistogram, that at first people were coming mainly from the east, going into the coastal areas of the Northeast and the Southeast from Europe. Meanwhile, there were people coming up from Mexico and going to California and to New Mexico, coming from Spain. Africans were being brought in mainly to the southern region. Irish immigrants started to come about the time of the potato famine. Chinese immigrants became a big deal right after the gold rush. Scandinavians came in mass when the Homestead Act lured them out onto the Great Plains. A lot of industrial people came from Eastern Europe a little bit later on. Russians migrated mainly to the Great Plains. People came in from Mexico more recently, since 1950, and moved mainly to the southern part of the Great Plains. This could go into a world history class then, and they could see what was going on in those places at the same time that promoted all those people to move to the New World. In the meanwhile, in American history, you can add things like when did the Homestead Act came and who was likely to be the beneficiary of it. Or you could put your own personal events on. My grandmother came as one of the people from Russia. We could add specific facts that are important in a local community. Or you can take the names off and make a quiz out of this and say who was coming in each one of these big waves of migration. I'm going to show one example of how you can tell a little more complicated story. This is the boll weevil. The boll weevil swept across the South in the early 1900s. And I've marked where it is in the South right after 1900. About the same time, people up in the Midwest were starting to build cars. And that dot shows where Henry Ford was out in the Midwest. Students can then draw an arrow to show that you had a migration coming from the South where the boll weevil drove them off the land, and then they were lured to the factories of the North, along with a whole bunch of immigrants. But the story doesn't stop there, because World War I came in at about the same time. And when World War I ended and the vets came home, a lot of companies were pressured to hire a vet. And when they hired the vet, they had to let somebody go. And that was basically the African American migrants from the South and the new immigrants from Europe. The actual depression in terms of the auto industry started in the 1920s, long before the Depression. And it was one of the triggers. The other trigger was the Dust Bowl. And what the geohistogram has done with a couple little bits of graphic is show how all of these things are connected in time and place. Putting them gives the student a clear visual image about how these puzzle pieces can fit together. I'm not saying it's the only tool or even the main tool. It's just an aid to systematically support the videos, the photos, the maps, the activities, the other things you're already doing. So let me give you one more quick example. There's where all of the first presidents, the first 14 presidents, were born. And you notice that the South and the North kind of just traded off. You know, you get the president this year and we get it next year. Then, the second group of presidents, the South basically got eliminated from that contest. You know, that right after the Civil War, nobody wanted to elect a Southerner as president. What we got is the ping pong game between New York and Ohio. You know, New York could have a president, and then Ohio would put up one more of the list of the longest bunch of completely forgettable presidents in American history. But the ping pong ball kind of went back and forth between New York and Ohio, with a few examples from Massachusetts. More recently, though, presidential elections have picked up people from all over because the population has decentralized. The New England and the South have both lost a lot of their political clout, and you tend to get more presidents a little later on. Now, this is another way to show the westward trend of political influence and economic power. You could actually add letters to show the party affiliations and so on. In other words, you can show just about anything as long as it happened in a particular place at a particular time. And that's like the whole point. So what this is a brain-friendly way to organize knowledge. It can serve as the basis for some hands-on activities, and we've already got about 15 of them out on the website. It's valuable to use very briefly in other lessons to help put them in context. And it's a great way to do test prep review. So it repeats the rationale at the end, and it tells you you can get this in a whole lot of different ways. but I'm actually thinking I should show you one of the ways that you can get it. You can get it as a clickable map because Dave took a look at it and said, this would be kind of fun. We could put the presidents up here and put the region colors here. And we could basically do what you just did with PowerPoint and maybe put Jamestown on here at the beginning or some of the different immigration waves. We separated the names out so that you can make a quiz out of them if you want to. In other words, it's one of the clickable maps that you might want to use. And while I'm looking at these clickable maps, you have, I hope, been using the US in the late 1700s clickable map, where you can actually talk about where the slave population came in and then try to figure out, were they growing wheat? Nah. Were they growing tobacco? Yep. Because tobacco is a crop like cotton that takes a whole lot more effort per acre than wheat does. Like I say, there's a lot of these clickable maps that you could use. And I'm going to end it up with one that I could have used at the beginning of the session right here. And that is that you can put the old rock line on that map here and add the mountains. And you can see how that line does a nice job of separating the mountainous west from the lowland and low hills east. And then you can add the forest farm line and then think about it. Oh, coniferous trees, the kind of Christmas trees that we were talking about earlier. And you notice how they're kind of en masse across Canada. Out in the west, the conifer trees tend to be up on the high mountains with the desert in between. Then you can add the tree grass line here and add the grassland. And at some point, you might want to put the cotton corn line in here. And I'm looking around here, and I do have a land use map here. But we've actually got one more map that you should look at, and that is the basic geography. And here I can put that cotton corn line on, but now in all of its splendor, as it wiggles around the mountains and goes up the Mississippi Valley a little ways and so on. Then you could add things like, the large plantations or where the Confederate States were, or where the railroad grants were and how the West was helped by these railroad grants, and where immigrants came. Like I said, one of the side effects of all of this low yield, malnutrition, slavery, poverty in the South is that it dissuaded immigrants from coming in. So with that, I'm saying we've got a couple resources for you, and the clickable maps have got at least 4 different maps that you could use in your American history classes. If you haven't used them yet, you might want to explore them for a little while. And with that, I'll shut that down and stop share here.
And with that, I will start sharing. And we are going to cover a couple of things quickly before our evening will conclude today. But we're going to kick it off with the Missouri Compromise. And what I'd like to point out about this, there we go, is we just finished reviewing a map on this, and here it is again. And here's one of the reasons why you might choose to do this with a room full of 8th graders. So we know, because it was literally 30 seconds ago that Phil reminded us what these different portions of the map actually represent. And now we're going to bring in a specific state. And here we go. Here's Missouri. And Missouri Missouri was eligible for statehood, and it applied for statehood in 1817. And at this point in time, we had 11 slave states and we had 11 free states. And so Missouri, whichever way it was going to end up coming into the United States, was going to break the tie and upset the fragile balance that had developed by having 11 of each. So, and of course, that's also Missouri today. This is the Missouri Territory. This is what we're actually talking about here. and only one part of that territory was applying for statehood. So obviously, there's a problem here. This would be a great opportunity to stop and discuss what that problem is with your students. And the big thing is that Missouri was applying for statehood as a slave state, and this would upset the balance of power. So the state of Missouri, or the issue of what do we do about Missouri, became an issue that sort of divided the nation here. So what to do about this was debated for months. And you had proposals to ban slavery, you had proposals to keep it. And what I love is this very what's the word I'm looking for? Good foreshadowing. If you persist, the union will be dissolved. You have kindled a fire which all the waters of the ocean cannot put out, which seas of blood can only extinguish. Thomas Cobb. So this is a big problem. And people who have studied US history know, obviously, that this is a problem and it's not resolved here, but it's resolved temporarily. And have students actually take a second to think about, okay, how will we solve this problem? One thing that comes in a lot is sort of dividing, getting like a, let me rephrase that. One thing that I remember when I would ask a similar question of my eighth graders was I would get a, well, what if we did a North Missouri, South Missouri? And that would definitely be a solution, but that is not the solution that we ended up exploring, or at least it's not part of. So now, here's a thing to point out that Maine used to be part of Massachusetts, and it also wanted to apply for statehood. So now, can we think about a potential solution we could go there? So Henry Clay proposed that we admit Maine as a free state and admit Missouri as a slave state. And then we say, okay, we're going to ban slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of Missouri's southern border. So we're going to draw this line, another artificial line across the United States, and say anything north of it is going to be, that becomes a state, is going to be one thing, and everything south of it's going to become another. So this line looked like this. And, at least in this particular case, it did help solve the immediate issue. But if I go back to this line, what if you've got a state that is, partially above and beyond? That could end up being a problem down the line. So it's just a thing to point out with students, and it's part of the Missouri Compromise story that we tell here. And so we continue to beat the metaphor to death here. We continue to kick the can down the road. And as we explore more territory and we settle places, and those places decide they want to become states and apply to join the union, we are always going to have this balancing act remaining for Congress and the nation to sort of think about. But if you think about that blue line, the dark blue line, I should say, on this map, anybody remember what happens west of that line? And what happens when the territory intersects with the orange line? So we have this issue and we have a solution for it, but it may or may not actually come to pass because we're running out of farmland and we're moving to a very rocky and mountainous region of the United States. So this is another thing to point out with kids, and that's why we highlight it in this presentation again, so that we can point out that, was this an issue? How big an issue was it? And how did we solve this problem? And what problems is that going to lead to down the way? So throughout the course of this lesson, we're going to continue to explore the expansion west and the institution of slavery. Slavery is going to get its own little showcase in every one of the remaining units outside of Unit 7, which is Reconstruction, because we don't have slavery at that point, but at least not officially. So this is the overview presentation. You will take a lot longer than I did going through it with your students, because you're going to stop, you're going to let them think about it, talk about it with some partner pairs, and then you're going to move back into the presentation and take it from there. So the next portion of the evening, you will notice as we continue to talk about slavery and the role that it played in the development of the United States, you'll notice that step 3 in this lesson, which I'm going to pull up right now, lesson 2, step 3, you have a big list of great readings that get a little bit deeper into different slave accounts. I've sent you to part of the story of Harriet Jacobs in here. Um, she was a slave woman who actually escaped north very slowly. She spent several years in hiding underneath her grandmother's porch before she felt safe enough to move north. She has a very remarkable story, and I always liked to weave portions of it into my instruction with my eighth graders. And they always seem to eat it up. I had many copies of the book on my bookshelf, and after we would do these little short burst readings and I told them a little bit more about her, copies of that book would fly off the shelves. So that may be Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, maybe one that you want to try to add to your personal classroom library if you've got one, because I can tell you, I did not think my eighth graders would eat it up to the point that I couldn't keep copies of the book on my shelf, but they did. So it's a very interesting, she has a very interesting account. So with some of these readings, you're going to see several handouts, and it starts with Wes Brady describing his life under slavery. And you're going to see a handout on the talk to the text protocol. And you're also going to see a mocked up version of the Wes Brady text. And what I want you guys to recognize about this is that we are giving you a strategy that is very well researched that you may choose to employ. Now, the exact way to do this is described in a different handout here, but this is the end result. This is what happens after you've done a talk to the text. So, with a talk to the text, you are going to, it's all about thinking about your thinking, and it's all about metacognition. So, with a talk to the text, if you've ever read something and gotten to the end of a paragraph and realized, oh, I was not just reading that, I was building my shopping list in my head. You've experienced a metacognitive moment that adults are naturally inclined to notice. Kids don't always notice this, though. They might get 10, 15, 20 pages into a book before they realize they've absorbed absolutely nothing from it. So, practicing a strategy like talk to the text starts to train kids to do just what you are seeing here and what I talked about. It's starting to get them to realize what's going on in their head while they're reading. So you would model this, and you're going to model a lot of it at first. And every time you employ the talk to the text strategy, you're going to model a little bit less and a little bit less and a little bit less until you get to the point where you are simply saying, hey, we're going to take 5 minutes to talk to this particular text. And then you use your thoughts and noticings to sort of run the conversation. So here, this is the Wes Brady one, and I've mocked it up for you and included it in the Giants materials here. Um, some white folks might want to put me back in slavery if I tells how we was used in slavery time, but asks me for the truth. And so as I'm reading this, I'm recognizing, gosh, the dialect's a little hard to understand. So it's definitely in a voice that I haven't noticed. So I might, or that I haven't trained myself to listen to. So I might make note of that in the column. That's not a note that I have here already, but were I in a room with you right now with a document camera, we'd be doing that. But then you'll also notice if they're asking for the truth, why are they mad at the answer? Which is an interesting thought to dissect a little bit more with your students after you're done talking with the text. All I would say is I would read this out loud and then I would say and write down on my sheet of paper, if they're asking for the truth, why be mad at the answer? Because that's the thought that went through my head when I sat down to talk to this particular text. The overseer was straddling his big horse at 3 o'clock in the morning, rousting the hands off to the field. Not entirely certain what he's seeing here. I think he's riding his horse, but I'm not entirely certain. I'm gonna read on and see if that is the case. He got them all lined up and then come back over to the house for breakfast. The rows was a mile long, and no matter how much grass was in them, if you leaves one sprig on your row, they beats you nearly to death. So I've underlined this, and that seems really harsh for missing something so easily missed. And that's again another opportunity for you when you discuss this after you're done talking to the text to get kids' reaction to that before. Um, every student in your classroom will have been told at some point by their parent or guardian to pick up their room, and said parent or guardian will come upstairs to inspect the room and find something that the student missed. Like that's just an inevitability. a word I can't apparently say right now. It's inevitable. There we go. So, this seems really harsh for missing something, especially since every student can probably identify with, yep, I cleaned something up and I missed it. So here's where I would stop and I would say, now you've seen me talk to this text a little bit. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to finish reading this and you talk to the text. You notice what's going on in your brain while you're reading this and record your thoughts on the side of the paper. When you have completed this activity, you are then going to have people, you're going to continue to share some of your thoughts, but you're going to invite them to share some of theirs as well. And the more you do this strategy, two things happen. The more people will have some decent stuff to share, and the more the kids will complain, "Oh Lord, we're talking to the text again." But it is a very good strategy that I have seen in wide use that very much gets kids thinking about their thinking, which is something that shows up in the 612 disciplinary literacy essentials. It shows up in reading apprenticeship. It shows up in lots of scholarly work on getting secondary students better at reading. And so that's why I've introduced this strategy here. Now I'm going to, in the next unit, outline a variation on this because you don't want to do this with everything that you read every day because kids will get very, very, very tired of it after a while. But again, if you're pulling out a primary source, this is a great strategy to try to get kids to focus a little bit more on what they're reading and think about what's going on in their head at the same time and getting them better at that. So that is the talk to the text strategy. There's a good write up on how to do it here. My Wes Brady example is here, and Harriet Jacobs, we've got a printable version with some wide margins where you could print it off and have kids talk to the text. I've even had people talk to the text digitally by using the comment feature. So they make a copy of whatever it is that they're they're reading digitally, and they start making comments. So that's another way that you can do it. The final piece here that I'm going to get into is the age of Jackson. And we won't really talk about the assessment this time around. Anyone who wants to stay after will talk the assessment there, but you know where to reach those and find those, and you know how to access them now because we've done it for the last few rollouts. But um, I wanted you to be aware that I have also in this unit linked a really cool inquiry from C3 teachers that utilizes parts of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what I love about this inquiry, well, I love a lot of things about this inquiry. The first thing I love is the compelling question, can words lead to war? And the supporting questions start to get a little bit better at what that might mean for students to sort of ground them in the perspective. But what I love most about this inquiry is if you start to look at the sources, not only are kids going to read part of Uncle Tom's Cabin, not only are they going to hear from Harriet Beecher Stowe, but they're also going to read newspaper reviews of Uncle Tom's Cabin that were actually published in the North and in the South to see sort of how differently the northern part of the United States viewed Uncle Tom's Cabin and the publication than the southern states. So I really like this inquiry. You can use it here. You can use it in the reform movement. You can use it in Unit 5 when we get into, I'm sorry, you can use it in Unit 5 when we get into the road to the Civil War. It works any of these places, but I wanted to first introduce it here because these sources are a veritable gold mine and I absolutely love them. So enjoy that one. As far as the age of Jackson goes, you will note what I said earlier is true, and lesson 3 is where we get into the age of Jackson. So we have some pieces from the previous unit. I left this comment here when Phil and I outlined our agenda for the evening, so I can remove it now because I'm now remembering to point this out to you. These first couple of handouts, the resources on the Santa Fe Trail and the environments of Lewis and Clark, actually come from the previous unit. This is a great opportunity to briefly review them, or if you feel like your kids have it, just, move on. But I wanted to point out that these things came from the previous unit and they're here as review, or they're here as an opportunity to do them if you did not do them in the previous unit, because in the previous unit, we also talked about Lewis and Clark and westward expansion and all of those things. And this Age of Jackson piece is part of that whole era of westward expansion. That's one of the limits of designing whole units based off of inquiry that I've run into, because I did all of this in a westward expansion unit. And here we've got it over two different units through two different lenses. But you do you make it make sense however you need to and put it in whatever order you want. That's the perk of open source lessons. So to close off, we have an Age of Jackson PowerPoint presentation, which again is structured very similarly to the last few that we've done. This one is a grand total of 31 slides, and I'm going to move through it ridiculously fast again because I am well aware of what time it is in the evening. But it's the Age of Jackson. If you got this beautiful picture of Jackson on the front cover of it. And when you get to 1824, we're in 2023, moving into 2024, so almost 200 years later. And really, we have a very wide field of candidates for at least one of the two political parties right now. One of them is polling way better than all of the others, but still, at the end of the day, when we get to the election of 2024, we're going to be faced with two different candidates. And here in 1824, we've got four candidates for the president. You've got Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and JQA, John Quincy Adams. Jackson is a figure who's going to start to come into the spotlight here, but for the people back in the day, he had already served as a judge, he'd been a governor, he was a member of the House and the Senate, so he's been around, he's a military hero. He liked to advocate for the common man, even though I look at some of these experiences up here and I'm like, I'm not certain a common man is serving in the Senate or as a judge and as a governor, but he advocated for the common man because he started off as a common man himself, and he was very charismatic. You then have Henry Clay. My students noted that we see echoes of Henry Clay all the way to the lead up of the Civil War. And so my students decided at one point, my first year, and the joke just continued on from year to year, that Henry Clay was a vampire because he lived way longer than people should have back in those days. But Henry Clay was also running for president. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives for 13 years. And he was a well-known, well-established figure. You had William Crawford. He considered himself more in line with Thomas Jefferson. He didn't like the central government. He argued for limited budgets. And he suffered a stroke during the campaign season, but refused to abandon his candidacy for president. And then you've got John Quincy Adams. He was the son of John Adams. He served under Madison. He was ambassador to Russia. He was Secretary of State under James Monroe. He helped shape the Monroe Doctrine, so he's a well-known figure as well. And here's a chance to ask kids, okay, so based off of these descriptions, let's pretend you're living in 2024. Who would you have voted for, and see who they pick? In terms of who won, this is who won the popular vote. The blue is Jackson, orange is Adams, gray is Crawford, and yellow is Henry Clay. But the presidential winner is determined by a majority of electoral votes, not the popular vote. And in this particular case, we did not have a clear majority. So Jackson had the highest number of electoral votes, but he didn't have a majority of them. And this means the House of Representatives had to get involved. And in this particular case, they ended up not selecting Andrew Jackson. The area leading up to this was the era known as the era of good feelings. We were a little more isolationist. We had established another bank. We had more sectionalism coming up, especially as we started to grow. And, we lament sometimes the role of the media in 2024 or 2023. And they did back then as well. It was just a lot harder for news to spread. You didn't have big campaign buses with a press, with a press corps traveling with everybody. People had to travel through the countryside the old-fashioned way, and a lot of times they just didn't. They didn't make it to all the places, and where they did come, reporters would report on weird things, like John Quincy Adams didn't wear underclothes and went to church barefoot. Yeah. So they're focusing on personalities rather than the issues, which is completely different from 2023, where, we're totally laser focused on the issues and we don't really care about people's personalities quite so much. That is a dry, sarcastic joke. Hopefully, those of you who are watching this at home chuckled a little bit. Um, in the House vote, Clay couldn't vote in the House because he wasn't a candidate. He had hoped that his tenure as Speaker of the House would have given him the votes that he needed. The three remaining candidates lobbied hard. Clay ended up throwing his support behind Adams, and they agreed on many issues. Crawford was out, and so there was only one vote in the House of Representatives, and Adam ended up winning. So Adams was president. He appointed Henry Clay the Secretary of State. People started saying everything was really corrupt because of this. Jackson was convinced he'd been cheated, yada, yada, yada. And you can read the quote and talk a little bit more about this with students. So when you get to the next election, Adams was renominated. Jackson ran under him again, this time under the Democratic Party. And this is where we have our first big era of mudslinging, which of course also doesn't happen in 2023 anymore. Everyone is very polite and civil in their election campaigns. Again, that was dry wit from Dave Johnson, maybe a little too late in the evening for that, but the election results this time around, Jackson won the popular vote and he won the Electoral College. His wife died right after this. This was not good news for him, obviously. And he really, really felt that she was never really the same because of some of the political attacks that occurred during the campaign. It was a very, very, very nasty election. So here is where here is where things start to change, and this is a great compare and contrast activity with the kids. Um, Up until this point, you had government for people by capable, well-educated leaders. I'll put that in air quotes. You had, in Jacksonian democracy, it is definitely more government by the people, or at least that's where he wanted to go. So going through this chart with students, giving them an opportunity to compare and contrast what was and what will be, is another good discussion topic, because then you can ask them, did he live up to, what he had sort of outlined as his vision? So the final part of the whole unit really covers Jackson's presidency. We'll focus on his policy towards Native Americans. We'll get into the Trail of Tears. So, those of you that have been waiting for those sorts of activities, those are coming up. We have a lot of conversations about states' rights, sale of public land. The US continues to grow. And Phil's got some activities that come in some later units that sort of circle back to some of this as well. This lays the groundwork for some things that happen after the Civil War in particular. We start to focus in on some internal improvements, and we have the ever popular tariff of abominations that we'll talk about in this unit as well. We've got the nullification crisis. So while there's not a lot on Jackson in our content standards, you can't really get away from Jackson when studying this era, because all of these things end up being huge, huge issues that we end up talking about in both in this presentation and overall throughout the course of the remainder part of this unit. So you will end with, after giving this overview before students explore further, how did the age of Jackson affect the political and economic landscape of the United States? And we have also added this to the assessment of Unit 3. So, students will answer this question one way or another. At the end of this presentation, it's great to get their initial thoughts, and then you can compare it to what they think when they take the final assessment of this particular unit. That is the final thing on the rollout. The remaining pieces of this unit are fairly self-explanatory, which is why we don't showcase them in the rollouts. We try to save the rollouts for what we cover at the rollouts for the things that are either brand spanking new, you've never seen them before, like the overview presentation and things like that, or the stuff that needs a little extra attention. Like in a lot of cases, the Phil stuff is less self-explanatory at first, until you have done a few fill activities, and then they're super self-explanatory. But the first few times, in particular, it can be a little intimidating to open up a slide deck with 60 some slides and go, "Yeesh, how many days is this? This is like 12 days." Actually, it's about 15 minutes. The way we're going to do it. So we try to leave the self-explanatory stuff for you and showcase at the rollouts the things that might need a little additional explanation. But with that for this evening, we are going to sign off and say thank you to those of you who joined us this evening, and to those of you who are tuning in later. I will pick better dates when we do fourth grade next year, Phil. There will not be a last week of December rollout for the fourth grade rollouts next year when Carol and Luann and us are all back on these Zoom calls rolling out for fourth grade teachers. But appreciate everyone's time and attention tonight. You were fantastic, and have a great and happy holiday season. And we will see you next year.